Hello and welcome to this trip through the travel industry with me, David Foster. Every way we move around is different to how it was 6 months ago. Driving, commuting, holidaying. How is the travel industry going to adapt? If it doesn't, it may well find itself up a dead-end street. You're watching Roundtable. Airlines and tour operators are facing tough times. In the UK, train companies with far fewer passengers aboard may be taken back under government control. The days of global exploration look to be over, for the time being at least.
Lockdown is easing in many countries across the world. The European Union has reopened its borders for some non-essential travellers from 15 countries including China and Japan. Singapore and China have begun permitting essential travel between them, and Iceland will allow tourists, but only after testing. However, US Airlines have cancelled nearly 222,000 flights nationwide, and nearly 50,000 flights have been cancelled in Europe, according to flight stats. According to a recent Harris poll, 51% of Americans have cancelled or postponed travel due to concerns about COVID-19. As some international travel begins to open up, will there be a return journey to how things were before, or will concerns over the virus permanently damage the travel industry?
I'm glad to say we can welcome to Roundtable from Geneva, Alexandra de Juniac, Chief Executive Officer at International Air Transport Association, formerly Chief Executive of Air France. Washington, D.C., and we say hello to Elizabeth Becker, former New York Times correspondent and author of Overbooked, the Exploding Business of Travel and Tourism. And lastly, in Krakow, Mike Corey, adventure travel YouTuber who's been traveling from Canada to Germany and on to Poland during the pandemic. And we'll see a bit of one of your blogs, your video blogs, Mike, in just a moment. But Elizabeth, may I come to you first of all? From over-tourism, you say, to no tourism. Is that just a natural correction?
Oh, no, not at all. It's an extraordinary, lethal phenomena. However, with the no tourism, we're seeing something that I don't know would have been possible before. We've seen the consequences of tourism, over tourism, good and bad. You've all seen the stories of people in Venice happy that they can see clear water in their canal, people in Brazil going to the beach and seeing turtles actually able to come back to the habitats. Every sky formerly polluted from Delhi to Washington, D.C., clear, gorgeous, Manhattan blue with white clouds. And so we're seeing the environmental cost of over-tourism, and we're seeing what would happen if there was good regulations. On the other hand, people are in shock at how much the economy had depended on tourism. And that's because tourism has not routinely been seen as the industry that it is. It's been looked on as a hobby. You look at the various aspects, the airplanes, we'll hear about that in 2 seconds, the hotel industry, all separate, but together as an industry, tourism is one of the biggest economic engines since globalization began.
Well, I think 20% of world employment is accounted for by tourism.
Yeah, 1 in every 10 to 1 in every 11. Thank you, UN, for coming up with that statistic. And so it's this, good, the diametrically opposed results are just shocking to people. And so that's over tourism to no tourism. It's extreme. And on the one hand, the environmentalists will say, pay attention, because you're getting a taste of what could happen with the climate crisis. On the other hand, the economists are saying, pay attention, see how your economies are built around tourism and how you want to regulate it to see that you can make accommodations in the future.
Well, let's bring in Alexandra at this point. Airlines are going to go bust. Many are tottering, teetering, whatever you like, already at the moment. You're going to see fewer people wanting to get on planes. It's about time this happened.
We have faced an exceptional crisis. No passengers, 90% of the fleet grounded, a big number of companies almost shut down. And progressively, we are seeing, the borders reopening, which is the key point. Some processes in place for the health and sanitary control for passengers, to restore passenger confidence, but also to gather the acceptance of governments to reopen their borders. And so the traffic is starting again to grow, but slowly.
But it is going to be, it's going to be what, possibly 4 years before the numbers, and that's a very optimistic outlook, get back to what they were before. Was this the right thing to happen? Not the pandemic itself, but for a contraction of the aviation industry, given climate change, given people's travel to all sorts of different corners of the globe and the problems that may also cause. Was this not the right thing to happen?
I don't think so. For you mentioned two reasons. First of all, the climate change. So the environmental footprint of aviation. You know that we are responsible for 2% of the CO2 emission. It is something that we are conscious of for 10 years. Because 10 years ago, we made commitments, very strong and ambitious commitments to reduce our carbon footprint. And just to give you one of them, in 2050, we will have reduced our CO2 emission by half compared to 2005 levels, which is tremendous for an industry which relies, for the moment, not in 30 years, but for the moment, on fuel. That's perhaps we consider that as totally negative, but for the moment, technically that's the point. But we will reduce that in 30 years from now by half. The second point is it good or bad, to travel? Is it good for the civilization, for culture, whatever? I think yes, it is. It's an enormous, advantage that we, particularly the developed countries, have enjoyed particularly. And when you look at non-developed countries or developing countries, you can see that as soon as people get the purchasing power to buy a ticket, they buy it. It's not by chance. It's because traveling, it's a basic freedom. That's the reason why people enjoy, flying just for travel, to meet other people, for tourism, but also for business, for culture, for discovering other people, for meeting friends or relatives. So think of it.
But it's been very, very popular in the past. Whether it remains as popular as that, we shall have to wait and see. Mike, you say it is your job is to travel. You are a blogger, and we're going to see an excerpt from one of your blogs about your journey from Canada to Poland, where you are now, in just a moment. But what do you think, for experienced travelers, indeed for any traveller, the biggest fear is going to be?
Well, I think, like you said, I travel 11 months out of 12 in a year. I'm Canadian, but in Krakow now, taking advantage of the opening of the EU to Canadians. And from what I saw and what I heard in Canada and Poland is I think air travel is the main barrier. And for me, what I saw on the planes was mostly empty planes, mostly empty airports. And honestly, you'll see in the video, it was quite a pleasant experience operating airports and airplanes operating at that capacity. It was a breeze. I was quite surprised how easy it actually was. Of course, there's the looming threat of a global pandemic you have to think about. But at the same time, I was amazed how easily and how much of a breeze it was to travel overseas.
Let's take a look at what you put on to video, and then I'll ask you at the end of it if you thought, you say it was easy, whether it was too lax. Let's have a look at this.
On July 8th, 2020, I took a flight from Montreal, Canada to Frankfurt, Germany to be one of the very first tourists allowed in Europe. Okay, flight time.
So we're looking for gate 52, and as we look around in the back of the terminal, there's actually a fair amount of people. And yeah, looking over at the gate, the flight's more full than I thought it was gonna be.
Before boarding, I had my temperature checked. This was the only time it happened during the entire trip. Then got on a mostly empty plane. I was reminded about all of the extra precautions the airline was doing in order to protect us from COVID-19.
We're also taking extra precautions to ensure a healthy flying environment, such as using hospital-grade air filters and disinfectants on board.
And was handed a pre-packaged meal. Like if airplane food could get any worse. It definitely can. There was also no drink service on the plane. During this flight, it seemed everyone had their own seat group, unit, whatever this is called. Which means we could all lay down and sleep. But they didn't pass out the usual pillows and blankets you'd expect on a red-eye flight. I didn't care. I passed out and woke up in Frankfurt. Guten Tag.
Thank you. We're here.
When I approached the immigration officer, I was ready to answer all sorts of questions. I only got one. It was this.
Staying in Frankfurt.
Then, I grabbed my bag.
Only 5 bags came off that belt. No one stayed in Frankfurt.
Walked out into the arrivals area, and then walked out of the airport. It was that easy.
Okay, so you arrived safely. Do you think you were treated properly in terms of the health risks?
Well, I mean, the health risks are primarily how people are following the rules. And for what I experienced, I mean, masks are the law on airplanes and in airports, and people were following that to the majority of the extent. People had to take them off to eat, and there were some people who maybe had their nose out. But all in all, people seem to be following the rules. And in an airplane cabin, of course, people are worried that they're going to be side to side. But from what I experienced, there was lots of room, and people were generally following the rules. And if people do follow the guidelines recommended by the WHO, and there was testing. I got temperature checked before traveling overseas. But when I landed in the EU, I was just allowed in without any further questioning. But at that time, I have no symptoms.
I tell you what. Why don't we ask Alexandra about social distancing on aeroplanes? How is it possible to keep people apart? And what's happening to the air? It's just being recirculated.
You know, what we have recommended is, first of all, the mandatory wearing of masks in the terminal, and of course, and mainly during the flight on board. And with that, and if you add the fact that we reduce service with prepackaged food and that we clean and sanitize aircraft, we have measured that you reduce the risk of catching the virus during your journey to a minimum. And that also relies on the fact that the circulation of air is, first of all, from the ceiling to the floor, and secondly, it goes through filters. It is filtered, almost 2 to 3 minutes. The whole air cabin is filtered every 2 to 3 minutes through filters that are antivirus. So they filter the COVID-19. So we made a lot of studies and measures. We have still studies ongoing to measure the risk, to consolidate the results we have, and to explain to passengers the risk of catching the virus during your journey, and especially on board, is minimized. So, and much lower than in other areas, confined areas.
Elizabeth, let me come to you. I'm going to read you out something from the US Tour Operators Association meeting in last December. This is what they had to say. Optimistic. Roughly 82% of US TOA tour operator members anticipate growth in sales for the year ending 2020, with nearly half optimistic and forecasting a boom year with growth anywhere from 7 to 10% or higher. Well, it didn't turn out like that. This is from Statista.com, 100 million plus jobs to go worldwide. Asia Pacific, 63 million jobs. Europe, 13 million jobs to go. And Italy, just one country that relies on tourism, 28 million visitors down. Although you said there's been over-tourism in the past, if we all completely rein in, hundreds of thousands of businesses are going to go bust.
Oh, yeah. And that's the very sad part of it. What Alexandra just said about the freedom to travel, I think we're discovering that, in fact, it's a privilege. And it requires governments to take a little more, particularly my government, the United States, the American government, has not taken responsibility for regulating so that we can take advantage of travel, which I think everybody here agrees is one of the great pleasures of our lives. But it's more fragile than we thought. Previously, you would hear the UN World Tourism Organization or the World Travel and Tourism Council there in London explained that travel and tourism was the strongest economic sector in globalization, that after 2008, it came back, it's resilient, and so on and so forth. And in this instance, it's the most fragile. It's fallen apart. So that those predictions were rational that you just read. They're totally rational because since the beginning of globalization at the close of the 1990s, it's been a straight curve up while everything else has had their ups and downs. So it's a total shock, and it's
well, let me just give you these figures. I checked them out just before the program, and although you say it's 10% of jobs depend on tourism, and I said it was 20%, I don't know whether you'll agree with these figures. 1950 there were 25 million international visitors. In 2019 there were 1.5 billion international tourist arrivals. And one of the reasons that that's been possible is because costs have been driven down so dramatically. With what we're seeing now, are costs going to rise?
In some sectors it's a race to the bottom, and low cost. I think Sicily offered to pay your airfare if you come visit. There's bargains in Greece. But this is relative to the kind of money people are going to have to buy.
But what about long term?
Those tickets. Long term, no, I don't think so. There's going to be two sides of this question. The costs are, you're going to have to make a profit in the industry, and they aren't going to be able to hold on to those low prices. But secondly, who's going to have the money for that discretionary spending? In our country, and the statistics are worse for us than there are for a lot of countries, we have long lines of people who are going to the food pantries for the first time in their lives. We have people, there's no such thing as discretionary money. So you have the two sides, the price and the funds to buy those things. So
okay, well, let's get Alexandra and ask, if you find people who have enough money to pay for a trip on an aeroplane, and we're talking mostly here about holiday makers, will you have to put your prices up because you're going to be able to only accommodate so many people on an aeroplane?
What we have said is, if you have to neutralize seats, so to reduce the number of passengers per plane, it will increase our cost. So mechanically, it will increase the fares. But the reason why we said, if we take the appropriate measures to protect passengers from catching the virus, or transmitting the virus, you have no need to neutralize seats, and so we can fly with full aircraft without putting.
But you also have to deal with people's reluctance, perhaps, to buy tickets. You will probably have fewer passengers.
We can't do that without putting the health of passengers at risk, because as you know, in this industry, you can say whatever you want, but the safety of our passengers is our number one priority. And
okay, well, I do get why you were trying to say that, but I'll go back to the original question. Am I going to have to pay more for my flight?
You have contradictory forces. If we have to reduce the number of passengers, if you have more regulatory constraints or more taxes, more cost, the fares could increase, and less competition because you have a fewer number of actors that push the prices up. But currently, and probably for the next 18 months, the demand is so low that the opposite trend to push prices down is probably stronger. So what I would say is the prices should remain at a reasonable level. So probably pretty low.
Okay, Mike, let me ask you, I mean, you do an awful lot of traveling, 11 months of the year, much of that on aeroplanes. You're going to change your way of moving around now, perhaps drive places, get trains, and not use planes quite so much?
Yeah. Well, going back to what Alexandra said a few minutes ago about the extra precautions airlines are taking, I have to say I did feel safe on that plane, and I did feel like the employees of the airline and the airport were very concerned as well. As far as how my life's going to change, and a lot of the travel industry, you hear people talk about staycations and traveling inside their countries. I think that's a very important thing to consider in the future. For myself, like I said, my airport experience, my airline experience was smooth enough for me to continue to think about international travel. But for the most part, my concern is, sure, I may choose to go somewhere, and I might be infected or not. But what the main thing is what am I bringing to the people I'm going to go see? So I came to Poland. That's true. But I wouldn't go to a remote island somewhere else in the world, because I wouldn't
But
want
I'm
to
asking
bring.
really about other people as well. What do you think? Because you get responses to your blog. What do you think
Right.
The way of traveling in the future is likely to be for those people who want to move around but are worried about planes?
Right. So I did post 2 videos about this, and the sentiment was very encouraging. But I didn't see a lot of people who are willing to travel right now. I think for the most part, people are still a bit concerned. I think there's lots of misinformation, disinformation going around about coronavirus, and people aren't exactly sure the facts yet. Hopefully that will change, and hopefully it won't get worse in the future. But for the moment, the reaction I saw from the content I made is that people are still reluctant, though are happy to see someone else and go out and pave the way.
Okay, Elizabeth, let me come to you, and I'll throw one more quote at you. This is from James Crabtree from the National University of Singapore, talking about how countries that cope well with COVID will recover quite quickly, South Korea and China. This is what he then added, but in poorer developing countries struggling to manage the pandemic, such as India or Indonesia, any recovery will be painfully slow. And if you're talking about developing countries, they are the ones that perhaps need the tourists more than the others.
Well, it's not as clear cut in terms of who's been affected by COVID, because right across the straits from Singapore, you have Vietnam that hardly had any cases, that had, in fact, has sent medical aid to us, to the United States, to help us cope. And they depend a lot on tourism. Their problem is going to be opening up the borders. And I think those countries that coped well, be they developed or developing, are faced with when and how do you open up the borders. New Zealand, one of the first to say we're COVID free, they haven't opened up their border. The European Union has, and I think that's why everybody's looking at travelers like Mike and seeing how it goes. Opening up the borders, this is going to set you back. So it's not, on all of these cases, it's really not clear cut, but it's more how how you've handled the COVID, no matter what stage of development.
Back to you, Mike, and then on to you, Alexandra, to wrap up the program. For your next trip, Mike, how will you travel? Where will you go?
Right. So I'm choosing to do a 2-week quarantine here in Poland, even though it's not necessary upon arrival. That wasn't a requirement for me upon entry. And then after that, I'll be getting in a car and we'll be doing a bit of a road trip around Europe. I think we'll go to Germany and then potentially down to Southern Europe, maybe the Balkans. But it's always seeing how the situation develops. Making this plan to come to Europe took a while because things always change week to week. Countries open, countries close. And so I think for most people, it's going to be kind of playing it by ear. And I'm lucky to live a lifestyle where I can book a ticket and go. And also, if I did return to Canada, I would have to do a 2-week quarantine. So I can't really go and have a vacation if I had a normal job, because I'd have to quarantine for 2 weeks when I come back anyway.
And do you expect to meet fewer people on the road?
Yes, actually. I haven't left the apartment here really, so I don't know how many foreign tourists are here in in Europe. But I can tell by the flight it wasn't very full. So
okay,
I
Alexandra,
think
sorry, we're coming towards the end of the program, Mike. Alexandra, I promised you the last word. I don't know where you would go normally for a long vacation, Alexandra, but you might fly somewhere absolutely beautiful to a far corner of the world. Will you be more tempted to get in your car? You're in Geneva right now, and drive up to the French, Swiss Alps, etc., etc.?
I will go first by car, but to France, and then by flight to Sardinia. well, you know everything.
Indeed. And are you worried at all about what you might meet on the way, pandemic-wise?
No, I've never been very worried. I am more worried about the way the pandemic is handled by governments. That's my worry. I would like that to be very strict, very rigorous, but not too close and too locked, which has been the case. We have gone too far in some areas and not enough in some others. But that's for another program, I suppose.
Well, maybe it's the governments and the people in charge that we should put in quarantine rather than the travellers themselves. Elizabeth, I know you're going to join us for another program when we're talking about the staycation. But for now, thank you very much indeed to Mike and to Alexandra. And thank you for watching this edition of... My pleasure. Thank you, wherever you're watching this edition of Roundtable, for joining us. We hope to have your company next time. Until then, goodbye.